Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover, the General Manager of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, and I'd like to thank you for coming tonight and welcome you all. I'd also like to welcome our live stream audience and thank you as well for participating in this evening's event, and ask you to join in on the question and answer period that will follow through the chat feature on your screen. For those of you who might be new to CCEPA, it's an organization co-founded by the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, and the Center has a mandate to provide an arena, such as this, for critical thinking on issues of ethical content in our public affairs. In a moment, I'll introduce a board member who's going to more formally introduce our speaker tonight, but before I get to that, I'd like to ask you to notice the evaluation form on your desk in front of you. Feedback at CCEPA is really important to how we develop programs ongoing. So we really do actually take quite seriously what you write on that piece of paper in front of you. So if you could just take a minute before the night is up. Another thing I'd like to draw your attention to is this table, you might have noticed as you came in, has a fair number of DVDs on it from programs that we've done in the past. They may pique your interest. They're free for you to take home and enjoy if you like them. If you like what you see, send us an email. There's all kinds more where that came from that we can send off to you. We're happy to do that. There's also some information over on the table about some programs that we have upcoming that you can see on some of the slides in front of you. Phil Fontaine is coming to town on the 5th of March. We also have another event on the 19th of March on ethical investing. And on the 4th of April, back here at St. Mary's, but over in the Sobey School of Business, we're going to be hosting Dr. Michael Atkinson from the University of Toronto, who will kick off our series on the body politic with a presentation on the body as canvas. That's about tattooing and other piercings, body modification, the difference between ethics and aesthetics. So that one promises to be kind of interesting, so I hope you can join us for that. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Rylan Higgins, who is a member of the board at CCEPA, and he is also a member of the faculty here at St. Mary's in the Department of Anthropology. Rylan.
Thanks, Chris, and I too, like Chris did, want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I'm introducing Dr. Huish not as a colleague, all right? So in fact, I had to do a little homework before introducing him, and in the process was intrigued with both his scholarship and his teaching, and became convinced that we're in for a very interesting talk by someone with considerable expertise on tonight's topic, the ethics of protest. Dr. Huish is assistant professor in the International Studies Department at Dalhousie University. His research focuses on or involves approaches to comprehensive development strategies in marginalized communities in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Asia, so quite a diverse geographic range for sure. In these endeavors, he employs both activism and direct engagement. He is the author, and I'll read the title, of Where No Doctor Has Gone Before, Cuba's Place in the Global Health Landscape, if I'm correct, published quite recently, earlier this year. Where No Doctor Has Gone Before explains how Cuba's health program currently serves as a model, and perhaps, again, having not read it, also sort of advocating that it should continue to serve as a model for how healthcare can be provided equitably, especially to marginalized communities. He has published widely on how development strategies, notably through healthcare and sports education programs in Cuba, have worked to transform conditions of poverty and subdevelopment throughout the global South. He teaches a wide range of courses at Dalhousie that embrace experiential learning, engagement, and activism. His course, and again I'll read the title, Development and Activism, Methods of Organization, Manifestation, and Dissent, has recently received international recognition. He was featured on as one of Canada's most innovative educators in the Globe and Mail series, Our Time to Lead, the Future of Higher Education in Canada. And with that background, I'll turn the podium over to Dr. Huish.
It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and very excited that this program operates and exists, and that you've bared the minus 25 degrees to come out and join us tonight. What I'd like to do is just sort of dive right into it and to talk just a little bit about what was mentioned about the course that we offer at Dalhousie, because by no means do I consider myself to be an expert in philosophy, ethics, or social theory of activism or social movements. This is something that I've been more interested in as a result of having taught and continue to teach a course at Dalhousie where we have an experiential learning component where our students go out and organize forms of public protest. A couple of years ago, we did work on food security. We were looking at the issues of world hunger. This year, we marched the streets of Halifax. You may have seen us. We had very, very pretty signs that were done up. The students, again, coming together, organizing themselves this year on an issue of human rights atrocities going on in North Korea. So we had public rallies, we had solidarity marches, and we also mailed our textbooks to 55 members of the Canadian government, saying that we need to have a speaking point on this issue. This was, it has received a bit of public attention, and when I first started this, I was very struck by the response from the public about the course. James Bradshaw did a story about this in 2010, and the story, you can check it out at globemail.com, but what I was very curious about was some of the response from the comments section, from those commenters who will anonymously tell you their thoughts. And I just wanted to share some of those points with you, because to me, this actually is the starting point for a bit of investigation, a bit of discussion about why the idea of presenting a course on activism at the university, and also to offer an experiential component that allows students to organize and engage, how it met with this sort of reaction where someone said, what a bird course, a complete waste of money. Another loyal reader said, I wouldn't hire a student who took that course. Fortunately, our students continue to get hired who have come out of this program. Someone said they can't do this, they need permits. Another one wrote citizenship, because we've contained the idea of public engagement. Citizenship isn't the word that comes to mind from teaching activism, more like terrorism. And my favorite one was this: this is going to end very, very badly. This I found to be a very interesting line of critique. I mean, why the sensitivity to it? Even when I was trying to get the course through my colleagues here at Dalhousie to try to get it approved, there was lots of skepticism about the course. We were happy to get it launched. We actually offer it as one of the required courses in our program in International Development Studies. And what was very interesting is that when the course first started, if you go back to September of 2010, this was just a few months after the G8 protest in Toronto, I believe a lot of the critique came from a position of viewing activism as along these lines, of viewing it as something to do with destruction, violence, maybe even emotional outpouring, rather than looking at it as something like this. 1 month after the course took place, Tahrir Square kicked off in January 25th of 2011. And again, there's lots of questions that suddenly came out about Tahrir Square. Where did this come from? Where have other movements come from? Again, in the Middle East in 2011, right? There was protests all throughout, then continue on in countries such as Israel, Palestine. We see it again here in India, where protests throughout 2011, of course, using the purple water as a tactic of marking demonstrators so they could be identified and arrested later on. As well, we saw the protests in Britain, famously when Charles and Camilla took a wrong turn and went through a quite violent protesting group of students in London. Greece, of course, the austerity measures there, where even the dogs are coming out to protest. We have, as well, the famous Occupy movement here in New York. And, of course, Time magazine listing the protester as being the person of the year. Now, the last bit I'll talk about myself here is to say that what I found very interesting is as 2011 rolled on, we also had a hockey game that took place in Vancouver, and it didn't end so well for the Canucks, as we recall, and there were, of course, riots. The day after the riots took place in Vancouver, I got a call from the media asking if I'd be willing to come in and do an interview about the riots that took place in Vancouver, and I said, well, I be happy to give you my opinion, but why exactly are you contacting me about this? And they said, well, you're the fellow who teaches activism. And I said, well, are you trying to say that we've equated the idea of some sort of public mayhem, public destruction on the same moral level as organized protest and dissent? And I said, I think this very much explains the need to come in and have this conversation, as also reflected by this editorial in the Globe and Mail. The thing is that we see is that even today in 2012, 2012 and now in 2013, that protest is still around us. And I think one of the questions that we're going to get to in the next little while, I'm going to stop and ask your opinion on things as we go along, is just exactly what is the place of activism in our society today? Is this something that's always been with us? Is it something that we have perhaps ignored? Is it something that has an important role within our politics? I mean, just last night in Tunisia, the assassination of the opposition leader has resulted in widespread protests throughout the country that's resulted in the dissolving of the government there. So here we go. Let's combine the classroom with protest. What we'll do over the next little bit is I want to talk to you about protest not so much as an opposition to tradition, but to look back historically and see that it embraces a tradition of opposition and how perhaps we've been able to overlook that within social media and also within the university. The ethics of media, the ethics of place, this is my geography background coming out here, and the ethics of organization. Now, again, I don't claim to be an ethicist by any means, but what I'm referring to here is just more of the normative ethics. What do we expect out of protests? What do we expect out of institutions? What do we expect out of people who are engaging our system when it comes to these three tenets? But I think the point of tonight is to say that protest and dissent are quite essential to any democratic society. And while street-level dissent continues to define our politics, there seems to be an increased social sensitivity to protest. This is worth discussing. Why is protest seen as the best means for social change for some, and yet completely feared as chaos by others, right? Is there a way of viewing this subject in a way to say that it's really not such a black and white issue? It's not something about us versus them, counter society versus society, but what is the role within society? So this is where I want to begin, as not an opposition to tradition, but a tradition of opposition. I want to go back and take a look at some dictionary definitions, right? If we take a look at the dictionary.com in 2010, what did they say about who's an activist? They said an especially active, vigorous advocate of a cause, especially a political cause. That's how we viewed it in 2010. But if we roll the clock back to 1962 and we consult the Oxford Dictionary, the definition we would have found would have been a member of a communist action committee, is how we defined activist in the Oxford Dictionary in 1962. Webster's Dictionary, right at the end of Ronald Reagan's term, someone who takes militant action in the service of a party or doctrine. And then if we look at the Apple Dictionary last in 2012, one who uses vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. The very definition of activists has changed over time, and this did not change on its own, and nor did it change because a group of PhDs and schooled in lexicon tactics, they didn't change it. These definitions changed because through time individuals engaged their system, the system that sets out these definitions. And they changed their narratives, they created new narratives, and they built understanding beyond stereotypes. And we see a very harsh, very linear definition of who's an activist in 1962 to down in 2012, someone who's really trying to create social or political change. Now, in 1962, maybe only a small population could identify with that definition. But perhaps today, it's actually quite wider. And if we look at it, it's much more gentler. It's almost much more of a softer definition. But yet the reactions to the place of activism in society today is still quite harsh. So let's go back in time a little bit. The Lincoln movie has generated a lot of Oscar hype, right? We know the story about Lincoln, and now Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln, and his role in trying to pass the 13th Amendment to free slaves. And when the movie, the narrative we talk about Lincoln shows that there's this political mastery going on, the bipartisan issues, bringing people together to overcome a very serious social problem. But what's been completely left out of the movie, and out of many history books, you know, even though we celebrate Lincoln today, is the role of this character here, John Brown, right? Years before the Emancipation Proclamation took place, John Brown was an emancipation activist who led the charge on Harper's Ferry, who led the militant charge to try to rise up and try to create insurrection amongst slaves being held there. Brown was tried for treason by the U.S. government just years before, shot and eventually hung. Right? He was seen as a criminal of the state for that action, the very similar actions, the very similar end goals that Lincoln was after just a few years later. The question is then, why is it when we tell the story of the emancipation process in the 19th century that sometimes the role of dissent, the role of people challenging government gets left out? And we need not start in the 19th century. We can go much further back. We could look at the role of protest in the 16th century, from Martin Luther all the way to Martin Luther King. Even the classics, those of us who go back to ancient Greece, I mean, was Prometheus an activist, you know, stealing fire from the gods? I mean, was this a form of activism? Fast forward to the 1920s, Alice Paul, right? We talk about the 1920s, 1918 to 1920, up about to try to get the women's suffrage movement, to get voting rights for women in the United States. I mean, Alice Paul and her suffragettes lobbied Washington enormously, to put enormous pressure on President Woodrow Wilson in order to try to get the vote for women. Eventually, we see that, you know, Wilson did give in to these demands, if you want to put it that way, saying it was a part of a war measure that women should have the vote in the U.S. But there was 5 years of constant protests and demonstration, to the point where Alice Paul went on a hunger strike in order to get the point across. So consistent protests, but yet how much do we recognize Alice Paul in the history books? How much do we recognize the role of dissent, right? Memphis lunch counters as well. You see here the monument now in Memphis, Tennessee, of the students, the university students at Fisk University, who went in and occupied the segregated lunch counters in the 1950s, 1960s. There they were actually students who were taking seminars at the university taught by James Lawson on nonviolent resistance. They were organizing for years, months and years before they were taken to their occupations. I mean, this is not an accident to just come and sit at the lunch counter. They organized in ways about what to wear, what to do, how to act. When the mob came in and started using violent tactics, what was the response? That came from countless hours of training, right down to their wardrobes, right? And again, how to train in the tactics of nonviolence when you have a mob, literally a mob, taking violence against you. And again, to control that space, to think about the way that this message was carried out and now glorified in history. Martin Luther King, right? His tactics are now famous, absolutely famous. At the time, Martin Luther King had a massive FBI file on him. The FBI had used provocateurs in some of the civil rights movement's marches. Their peaceful, nonviolent marches were influenced by the FBI, by the very government. Again, a tactic here that they used was to, again, use the very language of civil rights, to say that, as he said, somewhere I read on paper that the true merit of the country of the United States was to protect the right to protest for rights. Right? So using the very language at the time. Now we of course celebrate Martin Luther King, the holidays, all the rest. But again, that was a long, dedicated struggle over a 15-year period that took place in order to gain those rights. Right? Later on into the late 1960s, early 1970s, you saw protests all throughout the United States. It was a critical mass. You had both civil and violent resistance. You had women's liberations demonstrations and groups organizing. You had student groups organizing. In the 1960s, 1970s, you had Aboriginal and First Nations groups. You had veterans groups. you had the entire country of the United States, North America even, boiling over with a sense of protest until this day, August 9th, 1974, when Richard Nixon stepped down. And if you engage some of the work by Howard Zinn, he talks about how this was actually a very pivotal moment in the history of activism, because the whole country was at a boiling point, a pressure point of anger, of dissent. And yet with Nixon resigning, there was a way of positioning the social ills of the nation into a view that say that if we change the leadership into that of Gerald Ford and bringing his golden retriever along the way, that perhaps a new face, a new personality of politics would somehow create social betterment at the time. I mean, if you look at it carefully, you see, Sir Gerald Ford's hanging out with rock and roll stars and golden retrievers. But what really changed during this time? I mean, Kissinger was still part of the cabinet. I mean, in fact, the cabinet really didn't even change, right? There's some usual suspects there, and Donald Rumsfeld and whatnot, right? But this group didn't change here. But in the 70s, in 1974 onward, as Howard Zinn argues, we became much more interested in the cult of personality with leadership. Gerald Ford rated the #1 shirtless president ever, right? We were focused on their actions, their mannerisms, and at the time, there seemed to be a pacification of dissent in the 1970s into the 1980s. And again, this is what we can look at. If you look at the role of politics, of engaging government at the time, I mean, it became more of a representation of the characteristics of the leader. I mean, do you remember back to 1980s, one of the election ad that Reagan put up? If we can maybe bring it up here, we'll give it a shot. Where Nancy Reagan came out and said that she was very upset of all the personal attacks on her husband, and that wasn't nice. Let's see if we can get this up here. We have Mrs. Reagan saying a word or two.
I deeply, deeply resent and am offended by the attacks that President Carter has made on my husband, the personal attacks that he's made on my husband, his attempt to paint my husband as a man he is not. He is not a warmonger. He is not a man who is going to throw the elderly out on the street and cut out their Social Security. That's a terrible thing to do and to say about anybody. That's campaigning on fear. There are many issues that are at stake in this campaign. I would like Mr. Carter to explain to me why the inflation is as high as it is, why unemployment is as high as it is. I would like to have him explain the vacillating, weak foreign policy so that our friends overseas don't know what we're going to do, whether we're going to stand up for them or whether we're not going to stand up for them. And the issue of this campaign is his 3.5-year record.
The time is now for strong leadership.
So again, she really didn't like the critiques, the personal attacks. She was upset by that. That was actually we can even trace some elements of our political engagement today, that there's a lot to do with the personality of leadership. But we also see at the time, go back to the early 1980s when there was, the outmigration of jobs from Michigan, the population of Michigan going down with the GM plant closings, recession starting to hit in the early parts of the 1980s, and yet there wasn't a whole lot of backlash to the levels that we saw in the 1960s. The other things that we see emerging throughout the 1980s and the 1990s was actually a form of institutionalization of protest. The institutionalization of non-governmental organizations and protests. And it became an era when interest groups lobbied government for us. We could simply donate to Oxfam and Greenpeace and let them figure out where the funny costumes are and go and pose with make fun of the G8 leaders. And when critique focused on political leadership rather than structural deficiencies in society. So basically we have an era where the NGOs helped us out. They were able to say the message for us for quite a many years, right? It's not citizens going up and putting down the Greenpeace flag. Greenpeace will do that for us with your generous donations. And of course, PETA doing massive public awareness campaigns for their movements as well. That was the 80s, 1990s a bit, and then we had the Battle of Seattle, right? This is a very truncated history of activism. I will definitely attest to that. But the Battle of Seattle was seen in many ways as as a flash of multiple forms of resistance. It was no longer just one protest. It was no longer just one form of dissent. It was multiple organizations coming together to essentially protest the lack of transparency with the new shape of the global economy, right? The Battle of Seattle, the recognition that institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization just haven't consulted people on the ground. And so now there's activists, NGOs who are trying to speak for the unrepresented and to engage directly with those in power. But as we realize from looking at history that it was the violence of the Seattle protests, it was the violent demonstrations that tend to occupy the largest spaces of history there, the symbolic violence starting off. And this is where we get into the new millennium era of protests as well. The Occupy Wall Street movement, again, after, say, a 10-year hiatus, I'd say, between the war on terror starting out in 2001 up until Tahrir Square, we basically went through a 10-year period where there was lots of anti-war demonstrations, there was lots of dissent, but there was also perhaps a cultural norm to say that it wasn't appropriate to protest in times of war and emergency. To critique the state was to, in some cases, be considered to be a dissident of the state. But when it comes to what we see here in Occupy, coming back in 2011, is that we have a worldwide phenomenon. We have multiple groups forming across the world rather quickly. And again, we'll come back to them, but using a form of horizontal governance, right? We are the 99%. What do we want? We're going to use horizontal governance. We will figure out demands, and we'll get back to you. Essentially the same sort of methodology that we saw in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 2005. So that's a very slam dunk history of activism from the 19th century to today. But what we want to focus on here is just there's a difference, I think, from some of these movements, some of these eras, of the role of media, the role of place, and the role of organizations. So maybe we can have a quick conversation about some of the ethics of these issues. We see protests like this overseas, Azerbaijan or Russia, and I think last year in 2012, we weren't expecting to see this sort of police violence, police interaction with protesters in Quebec, where you had even The Economist saying in June of 2012 that Quebec has now put itself on the same pedestal as countries such as Russia and Azerbaijan for going as far as trying to ban and criminalize protest and dissent, right? With the law that was passed to say you could be up to 10 years in prison if you were organizing dissent in the streets of Montreal, but if you were a policeman, you could get paid triple time. There's many critiques about how the media represented this. This is something that we can certainly discuss. I don't want to pose a definitive answer on this, but just the way that it was represented within Quebec and also the way that the English media exposed the student protests as well. I mean, was it a bothersome thing that the students were out there? Were they worried about the small increase in tuition? Were they really defending the education as a right? What was their message, and what role did the representation of the media play? This was one of the more famous shots that came out of the Montreal protests, right? We see the policeman here who's striking the protester right on the top of the leg. Now, if there's anyone from the law enforcement community here tonight, I would ask you, what is the purpose of actually striking an individual on the top of their leg with a baton? We have no police here tonight. Okay, that's good. One of the reasons for it is that this hurts. This is a very serious use of force. And to strike an individual here in the upper leg, you have a lot of muscle tissue there. To use this force on the head, you're going to create lesions and concussions. You may knock teeth out. It doesn't look good on the cameras. Now, when protesters were struck with batons, you could see the very deep impact wounds that come from it. This is not just a small little encouragement to get out of the way. This is an absolute bit of trauma. This is absolute pain that's being invoked. Right? A day later, this individual's leg turned to that color. Massive subcutaneous bleeding. Another day there. This individual has gone through many hours of physiotherapy, physician's appointments. Now, essentially, in June 2012, in Canada, we were allowing this sort of impact to be had on protesters. There was no major critique out of the popular media to say that this is fundamentally wrong. Look, they're just hitting them in the legs, right? If there was critique, it was rather dulled out. I mean, the amount of damage done by a baton, look at that subcutaneous bleeding, can be equivalent to this example here, which is an individual who's gone through a car accident, right? It's a similar sort of bruising. You know, it's still quite illegal in the country to drive a car into someone's knee, but in this case, in the summer of 2012, we were actually encouraging our law enforcement officers, paying them extra to use this sort of force on protesters, on citizens, on students. Were these pariahs of the state? Were they from somewhere else that needed to be removed from society? Or does it come from a particular appetite when it comes to media representations of protest to seek out violence? Do we actually seek out some of these more dramatic moments, right? We go back to 2010, the G8, right? Here's a demonstration going outside of, I'm not exactly sure the street, but it's in downtown Toronto. It's hard to get a sense of what the message is. What is this group after, right? There's maybe many messages, competing messages. What is the actual message that's trying to get across, right? As the day unfolded in late June of 2010, we saw that the battles came out, the riot police were present, and the protesters stood in the way. And we also see that a lot of the media representation focused around that sort of imagery, about the role of the police, the police protecting civilians from the potential harm from protesters. So, a couple questions. If we could take a few minutes, I'll time it, maybe 5 to 8 minutes, just to think about the following points. You know, when we think about the role of representation of protest and dissent, do we intentionally sensationalize violence of dissent? Is that something that we are intending to do? What is served by the criminalization of protest? We will return to this in a minute. And what comes from violent versus nonviolent protest? Is one means of dissent more effective at promoting a cause than the other? Does anyone have any opinions, any discussion points that we could take a few minutes and get some feedback on to any of these points? Yes.
I would be disturbed if I thought you were saying smashing windows and burning police cars was protest. I think that is a crime. And it is what it is. Though I'm an old protester myself, been on many of them, but I would never dream of doing any of those things or obstructing anyone else's right to go about their business. Am I just too old to see it?
I don't think so. I think this is it speaks to the third point. I mean, what is the place of nonviolent versus some of the violent scenes that we saw at the G20? Is that effective at all in carrying out a message? Is it even going beyond the questions of effectiveness to treading on civil liberties? Is this something that we need to consider? Other ideas to that? Yes, in the back.
I wonder whether if we lived in a world without video news, whether the reporting of a violent occasion of dissent in the newspaper, which is nowhere near as sensational because you can't convey the imagery and you can't sort of share in the emotion of the moment. I wonder whether it would be different. And you know, now that news is a video clip, obviously there's an entertainment value or there's a consumer value to that news, and so consequently people look for the sound for the moment in video.
Okay, very good. Up at the front here. Sorry, we're making the gentleman with the mic run around a little bit, but hope you don't mind.
Thank you. I've always been concerned by what seems to me a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about what rights each side, if there are two sides, or maybe there are 3 or 4 sides in these things. For example, I mean, it's often said you cannot cross a picket line. Well, that's not my understanding of the law. But it is frequently the understanding of the public and the protesters and even the police, or so it seems. You see these incidents, and so it seems to set up a situation that becomes a bigger and bigger issue than it has to be. And I think we've seen some of that recently with First Nations protests. To the best of my knowledge, they don't have a right to shut down a train, to the best of my knowledge. But I heard police say on TV, they weren't going to do anything about it, and even seemed to indicate that they had a right to do that. Well, I don't think they did, but if they did, surely it would be better if both sides knew what the rules are, what the rules of engagement or disengagement are, and everybody could play their part a little bit better. But I think people get agitated when they can't get where they want to get, and the other side wants to stop them from getting where they want to get because they think that's a way to make the point better. And sometimes it probably is. But I think increasingly now, in some societies, ours being one, I think that's less true. Because I think people are getting a little more fed up here, but clearly a lot of societies where they're just starting.
Very interesting point you're bringing up in that what is the right to create civil disobedience? Do you as a citizen have a right to do it, or do you, from another point of view, perhaps have a responsibility to engage the state to do it this way? But in either case, how do you deal with the consequences? How do you deal with the reaction, either from the state, one organization who you're trying to communicate with, but also from other members of society? And this is where I think the role of organization and strategy comes into it. Are there moments in history where it's right to break a law? We might look back in history and we might say in that moment, yes, it was. We may say today, no, we don't have an appetite for it. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. But the point you brought up, I think, is quite excellent, that it really makes us consider what is the right between the right to engage and the responsibility to act. Any other comments? Yes, we'll carry on.
I'm a longtime member of the Halifax Peace Coalition, and we've organized many rallies and protests over the years. And it's been very critical to our work that we only organize actions that are nonviolent to be consistent with our message. But at the same time, we know that there are people that will join something that we organize, a rally or a protest, and they have an understanding of this idea called a diversity of tactics. And so they may, want to engage in something like something that's a little bit more aggressive than something that, for instance, the Halifax Peace Coalition would support. So that's definitely been a struggle for us in the peace movement. But just to say that we do think that there's a higher moral ground and that there's strength in nonviolent protest, and it's stood this test of time, and so it's something that we continue to do. And I'd just like to also point out that from our long experience in this, that there's no doubt the media intentionally sensationalizes the violence that may occur. And I'd also like to point out in the protests that took place in Quebec City and in Toronto, that there were examples of agents provocateurs that turned over the police cars and that threw rocks and broke windows. So I think it's really important that there's some critical analysis of those kinds of action, because we know that there's evidence that it was actually the police that did those types of actions to discredit the really important movement and the messages that were trying to be conveyed by the protesters.
Very good. I think I would like to move on from that point and maybe echo some of the details in a couple of minutes. The reason I'm bringing up place is because I think that what we see in terms of where dissent and activism takes place matters enormously. This is perhaps beyond just worrying about where the media is representing or how they are a form of dissent. What is the role of place in the matter, right? Why do we see political struggle often in certain spaces? There's always been activism, say in the Lower East Side in Vancouver when it comes to poverty, right? But here, when the Olympics were coming to Vancouver, you saw an escalation of that. You saw, end poverty, it's not a game, handcuffs instead of the Olympic rings there. Urban spaces create a geography of authority. I want to talk to you about this for a couple minutes, and creates room for mobilization of alternative movements within there. This is why the urban space in particular is a very politically complex landscape. They provide sites of political action, and they are themselves politicized in contests of access, control, and representation. So, again, what is the significance of draping a banner over the buildings of Parliament? What's the target? Who is being targeted there? Is it the Prime Minister? He's inside, speaking in the House of Commons. Is it the media? Is it the public coming by? Is it other workers in Ottawa? Who is actually meant to receive this message in this space? When there's a protest over the development of the oil pipelines, the Northern Gateway, what is the significance? What is the symbolic value of creating this scene right out in front of Enbridge's headquarters? What would be the difference of the story if it was to take place just a few blocks down the road, or if it was to take place, say, in the forest, where an oil spill could very well occur? Of course, Occupy Wall Street, a very interesting one. The idea of Wall Street was really what was occupied. The physical geography, not so much, because here's the stock exchange here, and here's Zuccotti Park, a couple blocks away. It was actually physically impossible to occupy out in front of the stock exchange. The police would never tolerate that. But here in the park, it lasted for quite some time. What about the Occupy movement here? A lone man or lone person with a tent here in Kelowna, British Columbia. What is the significance of place here? Does this have a powerful effect? Or is it seen as being sort of out of the way? Does it show, perhaps, the existence of global solidarity? Or does it show isolation? Here in Oakland, the scenes of violence in Occupy Oakland around the ports. What are the messages here that are coming out of this landscape? I mean, who's really being challenged in these spaces? Right? Who is responding negatively to the idea of peaceful, nonviolent protest in these areas? I mean, let's turn to Paris, a city that has known protests for hundreds of years, if not more. When Paris was being redesigned in the late 19th century, they had these huge boulevards going through here, and when Napoleon III was redesigning Paris, these massive boulevards, right? Huge. I mean, look at it. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lanes of traffic plus the sidewalk. In the 19th century, traffic in Paris wasn't so bad. But what was the real purpose of these landscapes, right? It wasn't jam-packed full of cars at the Champs-Élysées. In fact, it was meant to be an exhibition space, to march the army, to show the authority of the state in this place. And this is what we see now, that if you have these geographies of authority, these streets that have been designed to show power and government control, that when it's occupied through strikes and demonstration and protest, it in many ways challenges the authority of the state. Right? This actually gets into our subconsciousness at a certain level, and this is why I think people begin to emotionally react to protest. If it's in an area that physically bothers us, or if it's in an area that makes us question the authority of something, then it becomes a bit more powerful. Right? And you see in Paris all the time, the boulevards shutting down, the well-organized unions. We have the metal workers here posing, strategically organizing for shots like this that show that they are controlling the city. The city cannot function without them. They need to be part of Parisian society. Right? The organization of then even going further to draw the wicked caricatures of our political leaders. But what about other spaces where protest occurs in Paris? What about here in the suburbs, where almost on a daily basis there's a car burning, there's some window being smashed, there's a police car being overturned? Out here in the suburbs, the parts of Paris in the north where the trains shut down early so those residents have very limited access to get into the city's core. What's their spaces of protest and dissent for those who are marginalized from society? The Parisian example is quite obvious, that in these areas where there isn't great command and showing authority of the state, that individuals can often turn to very violent tactics. The idea that they're not occupying authority, but they will draw the authority in, draw the police in, draw the media attention in to their space. That is a different sort of tactic. What about in North America here, where we have an increasing amount of suburbanization? This could be a geography of anywhere. It could be Calgary, it could be the 905, it could be Sackville. Where's the space to protest in this area? This is a very private space, individual single-dwelling houses, right? There's no grand boulevards. There's no parks for exhibition and displays of power and authority. This is what we get, right? And the question is, how do we know the effectiveness of this? And it also begs the question, who is truly an activist in this space? What is the significance of their message, of their dissent in these areas? It begs the question about why then an event like the G20, the G8 and G20 that took place in Toronto in 2010, why would it take over the most centralized and visually significant space in the entire country? Of all the places to have the G20 rally and then fortify it and then put a $1.2 billion police budget behind it, is there not some sort of a symbolic battle taking place here? Is this not staging the ground for conflict? Right? Here's the downtown zone. We have the CN Towers involved, Union Station, Rogers Centre, the whole show. The entire country is cognizant of this landscape. It's very interesting. If you were following the Toronto Star before the demonstrations broke out, you would have caught a piece by Catherine Porter. And she reported on this thing called the Miami model. She said the Miami model is a tactic that's been used with World Trade Organization meetings and FTAA meetings and G8 and G20 meetings dating back to 2005. She says there's a certain script, a certain recipe to it. And then again, this is before the G8 events took off. She said there'll be a multi-agency network, there'll be mass purchases of surveillance equipment, training of local law enforcement and non-lethal tactics. There'll be an information war, meaning that it'll be not just protesters expressing, it'll be anarchists versus well-trained officers. Anti-protest ordinance to prevent lawful assembly in certain spaces. There will be an information war, meaning that the event is meaningful. It's a target for terrorism. This will be in the news ahead of time. Surveillance of protest organizers. It goes on. Police protect the right to protest. You'll hear that in the news. The court system is co-opted. Different judiciary systems set up. Different detention facilities set up. There's embedded journalists on the police side. There's a display of confiscated weapons once the protest takes place. There'll be a legal mass detention and arrest where you have thousands arrested, few charged in the end, and at the end of it all, a few days later, you'll hear the news report saying, "Job well done, thanks for everyone." I mean, this is where the original recipe for it here in Miami years before.
Standing out in the crowd in a red blazer, black skirt, and heels, attorney Elizabeth Ritter received some media coverage 3 years ago at a free trade protest when she was shot with rubber bullets in the back and a leg. Her beef wasn't with the trade summit, but with a strong police presence. Minutes later, she took another rubber bullet on her forehead as she crouched behind her homemade sign that read, "Fear totalitarianism."
You okay? Don't get around me. Let them see it. Hit her in the face!
Now her case is back in the news because of this.
The good news about being able to watch you guys live on TV is that lady with the red dress.
A police video shot after the shooting incident, just released following a review of excessive force complaints at the protest.
I don't know who got her, but when it went through the sun, it hit her smack dab in the middle of the head.
Attorney Ritter says she was too scared to file a complaint before, but now she intends to sue for excessive force.
I was cowering with a poster behind me, but my fingers were in front of the poster. I believe they thought that my face would have reasonably concluded that my face was behind that poster, and that's why they fired that shot.
The Broward Sheriff's Office says Ritter's possible civil rights lawsuit prevents them from talking specifics. Officers at the scene tell CNN they warned the crowd to move back. Ritter disputes that.
Can you say whether you stand by the events of that day?
Yes,
the shooting
we do.
The shooting that day?
Yes, we do.
Picked up from the street of Miami from one of the scurrying cockroaches.
Oh, cool.
Wow.
Police are red-faced about their video.
Do you think that that tape paints a pretty picture?
No, I don't. Those comments shouldn't have been made. I should have stopped them, and I recognize that.
No officer has been charged or disciplined in Ritter's rubber bullet incident, nor is it under investigation. Susan Candiotti, CNN, Miami.
So again, we've got very aggressive action. We've got the police, in fact, having a laugh on it afterwards, and the use of language, the scurrying cockroaches. What we did see in Toronto was a very close recipe to that of the Miami model, a multi-agency network. Yes, Toronto Police OPP called the shots in a multi-agency network, report says. Surveillance of protest organizers. The G20 case reveals the largest ever police spy operation in Canadian history. RCMP collaborated with provincial and local police to monitor activists, to infiltrate organizations. As Catherine Porter asked, InfoWar, police protect the right to protest. In fact, the follow-up report was titled exactly that, Policing the Right to Protest, a G20 systematic review report. Next up, mass detention facilities prepped for use, absolutely. Thousands detained in Toronto, and again, we can look online to see the video images and conditions of the detention center. Information war, a job well done. I recall being in Toronto the day after that, and every single radio station, every talk show had both the mayor and the chief of police on saying this was a job well done. I mean, right from the more right-leaning talk radio all the way up to 102.1, the rock and roll station, where you would probably expect a few protesters to be listening. They said, it was a job well done for anyone. I bring this all up because I think that there's a need to question whether or not the role of space and the role of the state actually needs to reinforce each other, right? We see events like the G20 where space is created for violent acts. They're ready. It's a war zone becoming that. Activists are labeled as threatening. Some are, right? Protesters are targeted and detained. Surveillance is tramped. Rights are forced. And again, budgets are produced to control urban space. It comes back on each other. A $1.2 billion budget for the G20, it would be under a lot more critique if there was nothing done about it. By the controlling the space, the urban place in this way, does it in itself invite a sort of violent protest? And again, as our friend, colleague said here, agent provocateur, we do have evidence of this. It's a tactic, dates back to the Russian Revolution. Again, the FBI used provocateurs against Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers. We've used them here in Canada at the 2007 Montebello Summit, where Quebec police admit they went undercover at Montebello. You can take a look at the video footage there and decide for yourselves. But a quick discussion, we'll just take another 5 minutes here. A few points. How does place actually impact the message of protest? From a rural suburb to the heart of the urban centers, what spaces capture our political imagination the most? And what other ones do we tend to ignore? And does protest challenge the idea of public space? Even a non-violent, peaceful demonstration, does that somehow generate emotional response among citizens to say that it's no longer politically neutral? Perhaps even the occupation of the Parade Square here in Nova Scotia. Any thoughts or ideas from those of us who are with us now?
Thank you. I was very interested when you showed why you think public spaces were created. I don't think I'd thought of it quite that way, and I've always been very grateful for public spaces, and I in Europe I gave thanks to royalty and nobility for having the money to create them, and I think that is true of a lot of the spaces, certainly the parks and those kind of things. And I often wondered about the streets and why places even like Mexico City and a number of South American countries that were built much more recently, the cities, would still have those kind of spots. So I come with a fond view of those spaces. And I think that is a good place to protest. It's an obvious one, isn't it? I mean, of course, you're not going to protest in the woods. There's nobody there to see it. But public space is the obvious place. But again, I go back to what I said before. Surely there has to be a bit of a deal that says in the G10 or the G20 or whatever, there are certain places we have to protect, certain people we have to protect. They're there. So we kind of got to make sure they don't die on our soil. That wouldn't be a good thing. It'd be kind of embarrassing. At the same time, how close people should be able to see them, I would hope. They should know they're there. Surely there could be some kind of a deal that says, okay, these streets you can walk in and protest in, but you can't get over the fence, even if you want to get over the fence. And if you do get over the fence, it's not going to be a good thing for you. You're probably going to end up in jail for a little while. But both sides seem to break that after a while. Either the police start charging people that aren't trying to get over the fence, and that creates a problem like that woman. I mean, that's obviously a terrible thing. You've got to feel awful about that. And at the same time, people do crawl over fences and do smash cars and those kind of things, and that's not good either. But it gets out of control, or it seems to, and that's surely one of the big worries that the authorities have.
Right. I mean, if you have enough authority around, there's going to be incidents where you will likely have some sort of a confrontation, even a minor one. The question is, if the state, if the government has the ability to restrict space and designate, you can protest here but not here, do they have the willingness, or do they have the ability, as opposed to isolating messages, to try to draw those messages into their own decision-making? Is there more of a capacity within our state society today to work to effectively isolate and marginalize, compartmentalize space and protest messages, or do we actually have the facilities to draw a deeper way of exchange and engagement in through these methods? In the back here, yep.
Thanks. I wanted to mention three things in connection with some of the matters you're discussing. One, I was wondering if you've investigated the history of policing, or the recent history of policing. You might have noticed, I haven't investigated these things too carefully, but it seems there's been a change from the police investigating crime and dealing with criminals as part of their work to having groups, select squads, teams, more of a SWAT approach. When the special weapons and tactics were introduced originally, they were used very rarely, and they've grown almost exponentially in use. You'll notice that police uniforms used to be blue, now they're black. The idea of policing has changed. The recruitment of police have changed. Have you mapped any of that history onto changes in policing of protests and demonstrations?
Myself, no, but there's some good scholarship. I believe Waddington is the fellow there who looked at the history of police interaction, especially in the UK. That's actually a very notable one, where you actually had they're still wearing suits and ties, for God's sakes, going out to protest in the 1960s, 1970s, and now they're very, very quick to bring out the more heavy arms. And the question is, I think, within that, is the threat escalated, or has the need to create a more militarized space been the reason for doing that?
The second point I wanted to ask about was the forms of demonstration in the 60s. Some commentators have noted a breakdown in civility among the demonstrators in the 60s. You're out on the street with your signs and all the rest. That's fine, but there's no need to kick over the flowers. And that seems to have been something done maybe to get attention, maybe to show how serious we are about this. A little bit of destruction, and that sort of tactic getting picked up by protesters, or that sort of feel about public space. It's not really public space. It's not ours. It's somebody else's. We can vandalize a little bit to get attention, or just to let off some steam. Has that come into your research?
A little bit. I mean, it comes back, I think, where there's both a combination of tactics and space to say, when, as we talked about here, if you're going to create some sort of violation against the law, against personal property or public property, something that goes against the law, what is going to be the reaction to that? And I think it's the way that activists have tried to represent that response as either being showing the injustice of society, or perhaps themselves losing control of the message. And I point to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and part of nonviolent resistance tactics was to try to draw out a violent response from the state authorities, to capture it, to film it, to show what it's like to have a water hose and a German shepherd tearing you to pieces, to film that. And then once it got out into society through newspaper media and through television media especially, people could see just how harsh and degrading some of the response of authority was over something that was where many people just didn't see the necessity. So in that case, it worked to their advantage. Other cases, say the urban protest movements between 1964 and 1967, there was 54 urban riots, more or less. And there, the public opinion wasn't so supportive. When there was a riot in Detroit or LA, it's like, you've made a mess of our city, great. But what was going on in the southern parts of the U.S. seemed to be much more effective in terms of bringing out the message and gaining solidarity amongst others in society.
Okay, thanks. 2 out of 3 is fine. I better pass on the baton.
Great. I think we'll, any other comments we can go for? We can move ahead. All right, we just have one more point to make, and this actually nicely dovetails with this last conversation, is that of organization. I think what we've seen with that history of activism, especially the pre-1974 to the post-1974, is just how the tactics of organization changed. And I think that after we've had 10 years of protest, the war in Iraq, where it was often quickly vilified as being morally objectionable, to question the actions of the state. It wasn't right to do it. You were seen as being dissenting against the whole of the nation and not just a particular issue. That when we see the era of the occupations come back, especially here in Egypt, the reoccupation of public space, we see a lot of questions coming up. How did they get here? What does it mean? Do we just take over a particular public space? Is that in itself enough? Is it the cameras and the media to represent it? Is that what creates public space? When we think about the Egyptian revolution, how did it actually kick off? How did the media present the origins and organization of the Egyptian resistance? Think back to it. The Mohammed Bouazizi, who lit himself alight in Tunisia, right? As a protest, the fruit vendor there who set himself on fire. We heard that story. That's how it was told. Then we hear that it's a spontaneous uprising throughout the Arab Spring, that it's spreading from one country to another country. It's flowing over borders. How is this happening? People are suddenly out there in the streets. We hear that there's people using cell phones to organize, and one of the tactics by the Egyptian government is to cut off the cell phones. And then we hear the role of Twitter and Facebook and social media. And then the next part is that Mubarak suddenly steps down. We're throwing fireworks up in Tahrir Square. Everybody wins. The thing is that what we see here, we have leaders, world leaders, Canada, saying Canada respects President Mubarak's decision to step down in order to promote peace and stability. Mr. Ki Moon from the UN called for a transparent and orderly, peaceful transition. Mr. Sarkozy described Mubarak's decision to quit as courageous and necessary, and other nations followed suit. But does that timeline effectively describe the overthrow of a leader of the world, and then to have other world leaders instantaneously respect that decision? I wonder if there's not more to the story here. How did the media, how did the government leaders praise the resignation of Mubarak? They did it very quickly. Who took control? The army took control. What happened after? We're still not fully out of that situation yet. We even have the case of Egyptian man names baby Facebook for the site's role in the revolution. Right? We hear stories about this. But I think with especially this new era of protest that we are seeing, the occupations of public space, the nonviolent resistance, that we're overlooking a very key ingredient to these stories about how we understand these events, and that is organization. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that social media itself is responsible for protest. See, what I just want to show is that while social media helps the cause enormously in how to create change when it comes to these events, ultimately behind it's going to be Facebook in Egypt, behind it's going to be the Gutenberg press in the 16th century with Martin Luther. It requires a small, dedicated group of individuals working over a long term to affect that change. Let's go back to 2009, right? We sort of caught wind that Mubarak was thrown out in 2011. But as early as 2009, you had reports in news, and here you have from The Economist saying, although most Egyptians appear resigned to the fact that Gamal, his son, will succeed his father, there is considerable resentment over what is seen as an attempt to introduce hereditary succession. There's chirping of dissent in Egypt in 2009. Rumors that Egypt's president, Hosni Mubarak, will step down as president have been circulating around Cairo, but the ruling party has moved swiftly to quell the speculation, stating that no new candidate will be selected until 2011. Isn't that convenient? Exactly the year that he resigned, right? You got to love the photos when they're taking down the old regime. I always love that. They're on their way out. You see other reports. The question of Hosni Mubarak's succession is once again cropping up, increasing regularity as whispers of the president's ill health spread. The succession debate has spilled into Facebook and Twitter, where young Egyptians row over the candidate's merits. This is 2 years before. For good or ill, change is coming to Egypt. Indeed, the leaders, the political leaders in Egypt, as early as 2009, some say 2007, were preparing for transition. And in that time, Egyptian citizens, Egyptian students in particular, thought this is our time to act. We don't just want a hereditary transformation. We want some more a political voice. This is why the April 6th movement, you need to check them out. A student group that was formed in 2008 to support the workers in the El Mahala El Kubra for their April 6th strike, a factory workers' strike. The students disseminated information through social media about the strike and gained a total of 70,000 followers at that time. And in 2009, the movement scaled up for calls for greater democracy in Egypt as Mubarak's transition was being planned by the military. It was echoing a broader political transformation at the time. We didn't all just suddenly show up in Tahrir Square on January 25th, 2011. According to even WikiLeaks, the U.S. viewed April 6 as outside the mainstream of opposition politicians and activists with unrealistic goals of democracy. That was their symbol. This movement organized ferociously. For those of you who might know, January 25th, before the revolution, was another holiday in Egypt. It was Police Day. Every year on January 25th, the police would march through the streets and citizens would go alongside with them, singing songs and praising how they were keeping them safe. It's been celebrated since 1952, every January 25th. The power to transform the highest levels of power have been born on university campuses throughout history, and this is one of the cases where students were preparing for the January 25th parade. They had posters all over the city. They graffitied Egyptian one-pound notes to spread the message. They were graffitiing urban space. There it is again, the April 6th movement. And then when it came time for Police Day, students raised funds to send their leaders to Serbia to train with the nonviolent protesters who overthrew Milosevic. They also worked with organizers of the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. They had protested at Police Day since 2008, singing songs and chanting and mocking the police. They littered public transit with posters, flyers leading up to the rally, and sent out SMS messages. This was a small group of individuals who were highly organized. So when Police Day came, people in the crowd said, "Hey, it's you guys. What's up?" And if you look at the Twitter traffic here, this is Police Day here kicking off. You see, yes, there was a few tweets. It was getting going. There was an organization. And then after the 25th of January, you see the Twitter traffic escalate to such a point that the Egyptian government shut down the internet, and it comes back here. These are the orange, the tweets from within Egypt, the blue from outside. So you see this happen. And really behind it all is this group here. These are the student leaders, 4 of them, who brought it together, working tirelessly over a long period. Did they use social media? Did it have a role? Absolutely. Did social media from within itself cause Mubarak to leave office? Not at all. And this is where I think we get to this aspect of protest and ethics that some may consider to be a truly dangerous knowledge. Because if we come to understand that we're often astonished by the sudden crumbling of institutions, by extraordinary changes, in people's thoughts, by the quick collapse of systems of power that seemed invincible, beyond the handful of activists, there's often thousands more who are open to unorthodox ideas, as Howard Zinn says. Small acts by well-organized people, when multiplied by millions, can quietly become a power that no government can suppress. And behind this, the dangerous knowledge is that if small groups of well-organized individuals do organize, and organize well, they can have power that no government can suppress. So to think that Egypt is on the same level as Occupy, we see a departure. It's not just the occupation of space. It's not just the representation. It's not just the numbers that show up. I mean, here with Occupy, you had the ad that appeared in Adbusters, the magazine, and then the original call to occupy Wall Street. And then it's quickly scaled up with people from around North America quickly coming, organizing together, occupying the space, and now what, right? Is that the end of Occupy? Maybe in that form, because a movement to take on such things as social inequity on a global scale, you need years to organize that. So I think behind it all, behind knowing that when you've got small groups of individuals prepared to organize, I think there's a secret word behind it all that allows us to better understand who falls into these criteria. Think back to the women's suffragettes, to Martin Luther King and the Southern the Southern Congress, that worked in the civil rights movement. Think back even to revolutionary movements in Cuba. Think to Nelson Mandela, and think to the Vietnam vets. Think to those who organized Occupy Wall Street. Think about the casseroles in Montreal this summer. What is the secret word that conjoins all of these groups, including the Egyptian April 6th movement? Youth. All of these movements that have created enormous social change have been young, right? Nelson Mandela starting in his 20s. There was no leader of the Cuban Revolution who was over 35 before they took power. And again, that's the scene that you see in Montreal today. There's a sea of youth who are wanting to express, youth who are wanting to see change, who are unsatisfied to inherit the world the generations before them have left them. And I think that what we're seeing today with the ethics of protest is that there is a fervent desire to engage by using these methods. But what we need now is learning about how those methods can be brought better within our society. I think that protest and dissent has always been integral ingredients in bringing about progressive social change, and at times consequential social change. Is there heightened sensitivity to dissent in today's society? Perhaps. And perhaps that's because we have such a growing demand, such a fervent expression amongst the youth, that they're willing to occupy parks and streets before they even figure out their message, against generations who ahead of them would want to see a bit more order and clarity in their movements. Movements that are well organized with clear demands and clear messages tend to have a greater place in our political landscape. History shows us that, and I think that's what will be the challenge for organizers of protests and youth activism today. And I think the question that we need to discuss further is, can the methods, the dynamics of dissent be better understood within our society based on those experiences of the past? So I will leave it there, folks. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and if we want, we can have, of course, a further discussion.
So we do have about 10 minutes, I think, left for questions. Some of the questions, of course, were worked into the talk itself, but we will have another 10 minutes, and let's get started. I'll just say quickly that given that we've only got 10 minutes, let's make them questions and fairly succinct ones rather than robust statements.
Maybe we can take a few at a time and respond collectively.
Sure.
Just a couple points. You brought a lot of things here, but I think
we should all go afterwards, go home if you haven't read it recently, or reread it, review it. The writings of Edmund Burke and his reflections on the French Revolution. Burke is generally called a conservative, but that's maybe misnamed, whatever it was. Burke was in favor of the American Revolution because it was basically conserving values, things were to be for that. He was opposed to the French Revolution because he thought they were doing things to undermine the whole tactic and society there. And I think that might be a good example. I don't think anybody wants to defend the French Revolution and the god-awful destruction that came out of that. And anytime you start getting public protests out in there, you don't know what unintended consequences, however good the cause is, can come about that and that. And maybe that's why people were calling you in Vancouver, want to know about that. Just an observation. A lot of unintended consequences for that. Also, just for history, I'd have to think about all the things here. I think there were a lot of quiet things, not public at all, that caused enormous ripples in history. I'm thinking of Socrates and the Crito. He just went by what the whole state said. It was clear injustice there, but his act spoke for itself. There weren't no Socrates demonstrations or anything like that. The story itself just made that. I'm thinking of, you mentioned John Brown, but what about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who simply wrote a book which caught on like wildfire and got everything up there. Upton Sinclair wrote Jungle about the meat conditions and the packing plants. That ordinary. So I think there are a lot of quiet things that we can do to do this. Also, I would like to exhaust those and enhance those before I get to that dangerous public arena that I see you going into and getting all kinds of potential riffraff hopping on board and getting the things.
Yeah, I'll quickly respond to that. Well, I mean, one of the things that we look at in the class I teach is the multiple forms of activism. It's not always about going in the street. I mean, I consider myself to try to be quite engaging, and my students, some who are here, to engage in multiple forms. I think that's absolutely important, and I think that's part of the last point I tried to make, is that you see that there may be these moments that we gravitate to of looking at the physical occupation of space. But the ones that tend to create the most important social progress are ones that have been well organized. And that organization goes well beyond simply organizing a march. It requires multiple forms of pressure. I think that, to the earlier points about history, is that we see that some of the early Republican documents, of the United States, was that it was guarding, even though we know it was written for a particular social class, and we get that. But part of the language that was used at the time was to protect the right to protest for rights. And I think that at the heart of it, that is a value that most citizens can relate to. And at times when government, when corporations, when whatever relationships they're in, fail to respond to their needs, that there is that fervent passion to go out and express dissent. And sometimes the easiest place to do it is public space. Is it always the most effective? If it's not well organized, it can have consequences, like you say.
That slide that said, what's the single word that's the common denominator in all of these protests? I was expecting to see the word conscience. And, Dr. Martin Luther King said, my conscience leaves me no option. And it's something that I, as somebody who's an active citizen and that often participates and organizes protests, rallies, demonstrations, etc., that's what animates me, is, my conscience leaves me no option. And I also think it's really tied to the importance of citizenship. Sometimes protesters are dismissed and called, oh, well, you're a professional protester, whatever that means. We're active citizens, engaging in our communities and engaging in our world, right? And then I would just like to share with you and others that you don't need to have a lot of people. Many of your slides, there were lots of people. You can be one person. And for instance, I'm one person protesting the warships. I have a weekly protest. It's 2 months now. I protest every Wednesday from 12 until 1 in front of the Irving Shipyard and the Naval Dockyard. And I have a blog, Wednesdays Against Warships, and a website, demilitarize.ca. And I'm trying to take on the federal government, who is wasting $25 billion of our precious tax dollars to build combat vessels at the Irving Shipyard. Thanks.
for your points. There's a couple more, yeah.
So on one of your first slides, when you were describing your students, the comments that were issued described your course as being a waste of money, and the possible threat to these students was that I wouldn't give them a job. And then the one single word that ties everything together is youth. And I know for a fact that youth have far less material means. We don't have money, which means we don't have security. So there was this, I see the current of like the threat of financially withholding something from these people. And my question, I guess, I'm actually disappointed by the moral imagination of a lot of protesters because it just seems to be about money. And I'm curious how you feel about the way that the ethics of protest can expand its imagination beyond just material means to hopefully care more about conscience versus like, I'm the 99%, which is an economic statement rather than a moral one.
I think maybe we'll hear from a former student.
I took the activism class last year, but my thing is, when it comes to activism, is there's so much stigmatism against youth, in that we're like, I'm from a retirement community, so like it doesn't go so well, but like my grandparents picked me up from the airport last year, right after the Quebec protests with the students really picked up, and they spent about half the time complaining about it because they didn't understand it in the respect that they like right now. When it, like, and I think one of the reasons people focus so much on money is that because money is something we can all speak to. We all understand the concept of it. We all understand material gains versus more moral ones or ethical ones, because you can use economics and you can use money to hide problems. Like you can use it to hide like other issues that are going on in the world. Like people use the GDP as a means of proving if a country is developed or not developed. And one of the things they had a hard time, because their biggest issue was that the Quebec students have such a low tuition rate. While that is true, but I don't think they understand the concept that right now, like for me, I'm graduating this year, and I know I have a very bleak opportunity when it comes to pensions and retirement. I know I am going to be fighting my ass off trying to get a decent job, so I can and I'll be lucky if I don't get a job where I'm overqualified, such as like waitressing or working at a grocery store, because there's just no room right now for youth. And I think we're at a point where we're just getting frustrated and we're fed up because we have there's the baby boomers have had all this great luck and they've done all these things, and then when everything has, like, essentially when shit has hit the fan, we're screwed and we have to clean up the mess.
To just carry on to that, I mean, your point about where's the morals in protests, I mean, one of the things that we do see through organization, through the careful organization of events, is that those that touch on issues of human rights, those that touch on issues of severe inequity, that when it is organized in a way that gets into the conscience of other people who may be benefiting from the spoils of, say, quite cheap labor in China right now. We know there's been lots of exposure of human rights issues around the production of electronic goods in China, right? We know that's problematic, but right now we don't really have an answer beyond just, well, let's stop using iPads, right? So what can we do in terms of organizing to try to create social betterment in that way? That could be a very, very tough one, but I think that at the heart of it, you see in the past that moral sentiment does carry over into other parts of society. And when you see one group saying, we need a better deal in terms of human rights and social justice, that is something that other members of society can relate to. And sometimes when it comes down to the economic questions about differences in equity, sometimes it's a bit harder to digest across the whole society.
Chris, do we think we need to wrap that up? Yeah. As always, it seems like we just get started and it's time to wrap things up, but indeed that's where we find ourselves. I have several quick things that I need to cover, including, it's under here, right? What am I doing? Thanking Dr. Huish with a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.